Welcome back to Sika Strength. So you've obviously seen from the title of the video that this is a grouping of our experiences and knowledge, thoughts and views on training people in special forces, elite military units and some elite policing units. Now I do want to start off by saying that we're not pegging ourselves.
Yeah.
That's all I want to say really. So
not pegging in terms of this video.
We're not pegging ourselves as the guys to go to for special forces. Over the years that we've been Sika Strength, over the last 7 odd years, we've had an unusually high number of variety of different special forces from Ireland, UK, US and Australia. We've had people like Navy SEALs, we've had some Rangers, Irish Rangers, we've also had some of the US Rangers. I had some guy in some naval unit. I'm going to be honest, I don't remember what it was. We had to get a qualification. We qualified for it. It was very similar to other ones.
Yes.
We've had, who've you got in who've you had in UK?
Some SAS and then some SAS and SBS selection people.
We've also had some anti-terror units, some policing units from the UK. Who's the Australians?
The Australian was going for a tier 1 selection. I'm not quite sure what their units are called.
Look, a lot of the time people come to us, they say, this is what I need to do. And it's been over the years, it's been well into the double digits. We posted a content clip on Instagram a few weeks ago. I got a lot of demand, a lot of people asking how we would train them. A lot of our athletes, let's call them athletes for the video.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the meaning for them, but
I'm not sure what the correct term is.
We'll call them athletes for the video. Yeah. They are very successful.
Yeah.
High selection rates were very high. Again, we're not saying that we're like the go-to guys for this.
No, this was literally a viewer prompted video to make.
It was only after we started looking back over the years and adding up the people we'd helped. Now, there might have been more who'd ran our programs that we don't know about. So if you're in the military and you've ran some of our programs or policing units, do let us know. Obviously, we've had a lot of emergency services, like people, firemen running stuff, regular policing people. Yeah. So the first thing we would do, or we would have done initially with these athletes, was kind of group them into what kind of athlete they're. Now, I know they're potentially in very dangerous environments. They're, I suppose, calling them athletes is somewhat downgrading them. But in our head, when they come to us...
Operators, maybe?
Operators. That sounds kind of cringy.
Yeah.
So we categorize them into how do we train them? Like, are you an endurance athlete? Are you a power athlete? You know, when we look at someone who comes to us from rugby compared to badminton, there's obviously different demands. And as far as we're concerned, special forces are runners who do some strength training.
Yeah, I think that's a really good category to put them in.
Across the board.
Across the board, yeah. There's definitely bigger, more emphasis on certain areas in certain countries other than others. We'll talk about those later on. But generally speaking, you want somebody who is incredibly high levels of endurance, who is also strong enough to do the tasks they need to do.
It's all about their running from what we see.
Yeah.
There is a very distinct difference between going for selection and being in that unit.
Yeah.
And I will say being in the unit, training-wise, is much more pleasant training.
Also, coaching-wise, it tends to be much more pleasant. Like, when you're going for selection, we're really lucky in a number of these cases, selection criteria is quite well defined. You'll have a battery of physical tests that they need to hit certain numbers on, or they'll know that maybe a few people from their unit have gone for selection before and that these were the numbers they wanted them to hit. And so in that case, there is slightly more pressure to get a kind of handful of skills together and a handful of proficiencies together for those selections. To be honest, the hardest case is when the selection is somewhat unknown, or the physical tasks of that selection is somewhat unknown, because you're basically getting somebody in as good a shape across multiple domains and then hoping that they'll be pretty good to go when they go.
I would say something that crops up over and over again is the fact that how you would train them when they're in their force or whatever their unit is, compared to the tests that are being done at them getting into units, very often are vastly different. As in, how we would train them in their field and what they would want to be trained like, what they request, what their demands are, what they say has helped them, is so very different from the testing they have to go through, the actual criteria, you know, the miles they have to run, the push-ups they have to do. So you get into this position where to train them for the unit is very different to actually getting them qualified for it. And very often the qualification stuff is kind of weird in some ways.
Yeah.
It's really, I want to say annoying from a coaching point of view to train for, because you're looking for, like, say, max push-ups sometimes and a specific mile run, and it's a very strange way of coaching someone for those over a long period of time. And sometimes you don't know when it's going to crop up, you don't know when they're going to do it, so they're like, okay, oftentimes they'll be in the military already, so they'll have their regular duties right now, they'll be doing what they need to do, but then they'll be like, okay, at some point in the next month I might have to do this.
Yeah.
And you'll get this list of seemingly arbitrary criteria. And I would really like to talk to someone who actually is in the selection at some point.
And
be
who
like,
designs those tests.
like, is there a reason you do this? Well, I have to assume there is, because a lot of them seem like that. Or is it just negligence? So we've talked to one person who's currently in the military, and they're a very well trained person. They're very au fait, and they've been in the military for a long time. They think that a lot of these tests aren't good enough.
Yes.
But I'm willing to give someone a bit of leeway, and I'd say, is this testing criteria exposing something specific that you're looking for? And even though maybe you know it's not the best, are you getting something out of the results of this that aren't immediately obvious in regards to fitness for the unit?
Yeah, I also think there's two other reasons. There's two other bits of credit I'd give to some of those tests. The first one is the longitudinal data that those units might have, you know.
Yeah.
Like maybe Owen was there in the 90s and I'm there today, and Owen turned out to be a great soldier, and that he was able to do X, Y, and Z across these tests. So now we have a lot more information. Even though the tests themselves mightn't be that sensitive or mightn't be that applicable, you get a great bank from that. And then the second thing is I think there's value, and this is mainly coming from the group of athletes we've had through our hands. I think there's massive value in somebody having to train for something, even though that thing mightn't be the most specific for their task, but them having to train to something, bring their body and their mind to a certain level, and then achieving that thing, because it just gives the immediate indication that in the future, if we need to pivot or need to change, that they're probably going to be the person who's going to be able to train really hard or make this adaptation in their lifestyle or whatever, and then hopefully be able to go on and do that.
So before we'll get to the actual training that we do with them in a minute, or how we'd kind of look at that, but one of the big things is the type of person. So obviously when it comes to high-level military units or high-level policing units, the physical capacity is something that many athletes would possess, but the mental capacity and the mental aptitude is something a lot of them don't possess. And you start to see a bit of a trend in that as soon as you get on a call with someone, you can almost tell who's going to get it, who's going to end up there. There's a sense of kind of calmness, there's a sense of organization, there's definitely an intensity about them, but there's not this concerning intensity, there's not this desperation about them. They're very about themselves, and you see it then, all of the ones who are in the units have this real sense of adulthood, real sense of calmness. They remind me of an athlete who's on top of their game, who know they're going to win. It's like, you know, when tennis players are smashing their rackets.
Yes.
It's as far away.
It's the opposite of that.
It's the opposite of that. It's the, you know, when rugby players are lining out and you know they're going to win.
Yeah.
They're on the ball, but there's something about them where it's kind of this X factor. When you're talking to them, you're like, oh, you're definitely going to get in. I'd be surprised if you don't.
And it's funny because with athletes, sometimes the opposite of that, like the ultimate intensity model, will actually work out quite well for them. You know, depending on the sport, they might just be incredibly talented. But I've yet to see somebody in this particular realm, and as you said, it's not like we have thousands of people running through these, but in this particular realm, particularly going for selection, because I think that's a particularly difficult physical training piece. Them moving there, they know they have 12 months, maybe it's a September intake or something, and you do know on the call, like one of the first guys I ever had was just finished a physics PhD, and he's like, this is the training I've done, I'll send you over the spreadsheet after the call. 45 seconds after the call finishes, the spreadsheet gets sent over. Everything is super clear, everything is super precise, and it is, I wonder, are we somewhat biased in the fact that people who are reaching out to specialists in another field, that maybe they're a bit more organized than another group, and another group gets through it perfectly fine, but definitely there is a particular personality type that seems to thrive for this.
Yeah, I was wondering that, are those people that come to us the people who are already passed through a filter, that if you're
Yes.
coming on the Sika strength, you've already had a peripheral interest in something else that's not directly special forces, because we don't put out a lot of military content. I'm not sure we've ever made a military specific video.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at us, I'd wonder you're already biased through that regard, because there is sometimes when someone gets on the call or you're already coaching them, they say they want to go for a military unit and you're like, oh, I don't think you're going to get it. Because the one thing we can't really train, now you might disagree with this in terms of sports psych, but, and I'd be interested in what you say, is you can't train the mental attitude of this, the mental aptitude. It's some of it's fortitude or resilience, whatever term, but also some of it's like, for example, someone described it the other day where you're like running and then they ask you a mile ago, what was the license plate on that car, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas he said most people will be blowing and they're like, what license plate? Whereas this person, the people who get through, are like, yeah, they'll give you a pretty good approximation of what that license plate was or what that old woman was wearing, you know?
Yeah, and that is the mental side of things is really interesting, because the physical training, we briefly patched over some notes before this, but the physical training will give you some training towards ideal psychological parameters like high levels of resilience or high levels of grit, which are obviously helped by being in better shape as well. But you can certainly train those things to be able to put up with a bit more physiological and psychological strain. But that aptitude you're talking about, I'm sure there's psychologists and psychotherapists out there who could really make some strides there. But in terms of the utilizing physical training to bring about those changes, I don't think you're going to do it. Like, I think you can take somebody who might be slightly mentally weak in a physical context. When the running gets hard, they'll stop. When they get injured for a fourth time in 4 months, they'll just throw the toys out of the pram and stop doing whatever it is. Training can help that. Training can allow you to learn. It can bring you, almost take you by the hand and bring you through a stepped process. But that psychological aspect, those key mental criteria, I think people are essentially born with, or else develop in their adolescence and childhood.
The way I'd like it in my head is you can train someone to go from a 13-second 100 meters to maybe an 11 and a half.
Yeah.
But you're never going to get some people to a sub 10. It's just never going to happen.
Yes.
And so you could probably adjust these people more towards it needs to be done, maybe, but you're never going to get them to that sub 10, I think, and that whatever that is, that type of brain that they're looking for in these units. Then the training inside is usually pretty easy.
Great.
Yeah.
it's usually pretty good. What I found is the degrees of freedom really open up. So we've got people, and this might be people in country or it might be people on assignment currently, which the degrees of freedom open up, but you get these different hurdles you must jump over then. Obviously equipment, obviously environmental factors, if you can't leave the base, all of these things do slightly impact their training, but they tend to have a bit more individual freedoms. They'll have to do PT a certain amount of times per week, or definitely the people we've had to deal with have certain pieces of PT they must do as a unit or on their own each week. But a lot of those guys are in the gym on their own on the other days when they can train, and it might be that they really like doing some weightlifting or they really like squatting. For some reason a lot of them like to squat.
The biggest thing you'll see as well in terms of PEDs, and there's always this talk about like PEDs in the military, and the American military talk about it a lot, and a lot of people are like, yes, of course they should be allowed to use steroids. But the weirdest thing you see is that there's definitely much more when you're in the units compared to qualifications. Very few. Now, people could be lying to you all the time.
Yeah.
Obviously, maybe people don't want to say their career, whatever. I understand if you don't want to talk about it. But I think from what we've seen, I'm going to say none of the people going for qualification that we've worked with have been using or overtly using PEDs.
Yeah.
And it would make things a hell of a lot easier. But from the people that we've seen that are in these units, a pretty good whack of them are using or have used PEDs at some point.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of them have dabbled.
Yeah, there's one or two, especially the American ones. You had one guy who must have been Jack Reacher, I assume.
Yeah.
He was just actually the character from the book.
And it's funny because I actually think that's in some way correct, right? Morally, right?
Yeah.
I think if you're going for selection in a unit like that, I think you should be physically capable of doing the things they want you to do for selection without having to alter your makeup that massively. I think once you're in the unit, your job is to be as much of a horse for everyone around you as much as for yourself, but you should be as physically capable as possible, or as humanly or as superhumanly possible. And so I think in many cases it's probably an institutional thing. People aren't in the fold when they're training for it. And I know it sounds funny, they're all in the military. They're all training alongside their military counterparts. But when they're going for those selections, it's they're making the decision to go for selection, or they're being put forward for selection. And so it's not like me, you, and our 4 buddies are all deciding to go for it at the same time. Certainly that hasn't been our experience. It usually is 1 or 2 people who might be suggested that they go forward, or they've made the decision themselves. And I think it's much harder to make those decisions when you're on your own doing those things. When you're in the unit and all the boys are doing it, it's probably a lot easier.
The big thing it starts with is, if you're going for qualification, when it comes to actual training, is long-term planning, and load mitigation is probably your biggest effort, because the biggest thing is obviously the fitness is of high demand in terms of like aerobic capacity, often with rucking, or the Brits call it tabbing. What is it? Tactical advanced packing?
Tactical advanced to battle?
Something like that. So building that capacity.
There's people roaring at their laptops.
No, this is what it is. So about a year out is like where you'd really like to be starting ideally. Like, you have had times where people have been like, I'm going in 3 months, and you're like, oh, I don't know if this is enough time.
I remember one specific case where that did happen. I think it was maybe a May or June, they came to start training, and then in September they were going for selection. Now that person was an absolute beast.
Yeah.
In a great position already, and this was a kind of icing on the cake. But generally speaking, a year of really concentrated training is what you need.
The biggest thing, your biggest concern for the whole aspect isn't strength standards, isn't getting their back squat up, isn't what they're deadlifting. It's at what point, how many injuries have you? How can we not even mitigate these injuries? How can we reduce the loading on these injuries so we can get some training in? And then what is our long-term outlook, and how can we train effectively and try and limp over that line a lot of times? Because it's just so rare, and I can't think of a case where someone has been going for these units that have been with us who haven't already been in an active military unit in some capacity, wherever that is. So they're already doing, a lot of times they're doing these arbitrary fitness testing throughout, which I suppose you can't get special permission to avoid these PT sessions, but you'll get these random things where, okay, we've been told in like 2 or 3 weeks that we might have to do a 5k or 10k max effort, but you have to hit this or something. So you're trying to account for those. Then you're trying to account for sleep deprivation, maybe nutritional deprivation or poor nutritional quality, high levels of just systemic stress from the environment. And when people talk about the psychosocial model of pain, I think a lot of it's bullshit. There's a lot of people who are far more adept at this who would argue against a lot of that. When I broke my foot, the doctor didn't go, how's your stress at home? My foot was broken in 2 places, and my foot was broken in 2 places, and that's how am I going to heal this as fast as possible? But when it comes to these military units, this is where you really are taking into account that kind of psychosocial model of low back injuries, feet injuries, shin splints, knee injuries, foot injuries, hip injuries.
Yeah.
So you're trying to account for what is their duties like. Are you doing 24-hour shifts? Are you doing night shifts, which are notoriously hard on your body?
Big 3 and 4 day long exercises.
Yeah.
I think this is the perfect time to start talking about that rucking and tabbing training, because that's where a massive amount of this facilitation has to occur. The biggest thing I've found, and you've definitely found it as well, is people will come and they'll immediately get the heaviest backpack they have and they'll start doing that training.
Yes.
Or they'll have done it for 6 months before and they'll now be injured. And that, a lot of the management we do around that, so that rucking or tabbing is going to be really important. But now you have a whole host of issues that have arisen from too much of that. And so the training model and managing that pain, where you're still getting enough what you might call specific practice in, but essentially we're trying to make somebody as physically robust as possible, give them all those performance outcomes they need with a limited exposure to certain things that are going to cause issue. And rucking is going to be one of those major issues. Also, a major issue is just lower back from carrying the load. It's not like it's all running mechanics. It's not all joint and knee related. a lot of it is just weight on your back from carrying load. So when you're looking at that training, the major thing people tend to do is they then pull back from the strength work, pull back from the rehab work, pull back from any loading, and say 3 times a week of rucking has done this damage to me, so I'm going to pull it back to 2 times a week of rucking, but then I'm going to stop lifting as well. And I feel like if there was to categorize one major priority of conversation when we're talking to these guys, and we use guys and lads all the time, but these people, it is trying to get it across that the S&C work they're doing is somewhat preventive maintenance as much as it is to improve their performance. So it's building the capacity in the back, building the capacity in the joints and the legs to be able to put up with the amount of training they need to do. And then that training will allow them to do all of the selection criteria in their tests.
So like if you're looking at a prospective qualification, you probably are looking at, maybe if you're watching this channel, you probably have some reasonable knowledge in strength conditioning, and you might think training for this is going to be somewhat unusual. Treat it like a bleep test or a yo-yo test or whatever, in the fact that doing the test is the best way to train for those tests. So you need to look at, how can I fit in the standards that they're going to be looking for into my training while possibly still advancing some of my other areas of physicality. So let's take running, push-ups and pull-ups, and then you'll probably get a certain scoring. You'll get a certain band of what score you'll get based on how high you rank them, if we're looking at that portion of the testing. And then you need to start looking at, how can I best build my capacity here? And in most cases, it's a form of like graded exposure. So you're looking at, if it's max push-ups in 2 minutes or something, whatever the test is, you're just looking at practicing that event and trying to improve. So there's no point you just every week doing that test and going balls out. But you want to increase your capacity. Maybe you might treat it like intervals or something. So if you're doing a push-up test, for example, or whatever it is, and you've 2 minutes to do it, you might take 30 segments, but you might take 6 of them or 8 of them, and look for a certain number across those segments, and then increase your capacity across those segments. So let's say you're doing 10 push-ups, and make sure you're not really failing, at least in the initial weeks or initial months, and then try and increase your capacity in those segments. So if we have those 2 minutes and we're trying to get max push-ups or pull-ups would probably be even a bit harder. You're looking at 30-second segments. We're going to do 8 of them, so we've got nearly twice as much time or whatever allotted. We're going to take a reasonable amount of rest, certainly a timed amount of rest, and then you're going to try and improve the number of repetitions you hit across those in a graded exposure over a couple of weeks or months. So maybe it's only 5 per 30 seconds.
Yep.
And then maybe in 4 months' time, you're able to do something like 15 and 30 seconds. And then every so often, you can take that 2 minutes and go balls out, because they're relatively low fatiguing in the long term. In the short term, look, if you do max effort push-ups, your rest that session is done. But you can test yourself every so often. So maybe every 3 months or every 2 months, you can see how you're faring up, and you'll see that then the exposure will be definitely a lot better. Your capacity will be a lot better then.
Absolutely. And I think you should be doing the exact same thing with those longer marches and longer tabs and longer rucks. You probably don't know the exact route you're going to be taken on. It might be a 10 miler for a time where you have to hit certain checkpoints at certain periods. In that case, you need to do the exact same thing Owen was just talking about there. You need to be breaking that up. You don't immediately go for a 10 miler with the 20 kilos on your back or whatever it is. You want to slowly build into it. And in the exact same way where I might want to back squat 200 kilos in a year or 18 months time, you're not going to immediately go out there and start squatting singles. You need to slowly be building up to it. And this goes for both the pace of that ruck or the pace of the march or whatever it is, the loading you're carrying during it, the roughness or how difficult the terrain is to do. I know for some of the UK stuff, the terrain is absolutely insane, like crazy heights or crazy gains in elevation, crazy big downhill work. And so you don't immediately go to that course and start training your ass off on that course. You want to slowly build into it. And it might be that close to your house, there's a small hill and you can do intervals going up and down that hill. The last thing then on that, exact same thing as the push-ups, is that pacing element. Like Owen is talking about, you take it in 30-second segments after 2 months of those 30-second segments, you have an incredible idea for what your pace is to be able to maintain that output. And it's a very, very similar skill. We all think about pacing when we're running, but pacing when you're doing those tests or when you're rocking or anything along those lines is something you can gradually build into. And it might be that at the weekend you're doing a slightly longer one. It might be your 10 miler, your pace is going to be X. When you're doing those 1K uphill rucks with your slightly lighter pack during the week, you can take a significant time off of those paces and push it a bit harder. Think about it like your high intensity interval training.
A big thing though is that the pace you're pushing isn't going to be too far beyond what your actual race pace day would be. So, you know, if you look at 100-meter sprint or something, they'll do like flying 30s or flying 10s or something like that, and they'll look at their PBs there. When it comes to, if you do have something like that 5K rock or 10K rock, you don't really need to be going to a place where you're overshooting. You're not doing a 15K ruck, you know, with a lighter weight too much, or you're not doing a shorter ruck but with way heavier weight. You know, so if it's a 20-kilo ruck for 10K, we don't really want you doing 20K rucks with 10K, and we also don't want you doing 40-kilo rucks with 5K. You kind of want to match the race day conditions as closely as possible and then grade your exposure there, because if we're overshooting, then we're definitely doing too much work and you're almost certainly going to get injured. Soft tissue are very often bone injuries. Like hard tissue is very common. But then if we use too much heavy weight, you're definitely going to be exposing your joints to something you don't want to be exposing to. And then if you go really light but longer distance, you'll still get a good training effect, make no mistake, but you'll find that it won't transfer as well when it comes to the testing environment to your staying closer. But that doesn't mean then you get to shy away from your 100-meter hill sprints at high effort. You know, that doesn't mean you get to shy away from your tablet on the assault bike when needed, but you don't really want to be overshooting too much. And even if you find that you're particularly good at one of those events, I wouldn't really want you overshooting there either. So if it is, let's say, that 20K or the 10K 20-kilo ruck, if you can blitz that, put your energy elsewhere, because if you're very good, then you don't need to worry about too much. Still lean into it, make sure you're going to get what you need to get out of it and practice it as much as you need to maintain it. But you don't need to be in a place where you're destroying that time. You know, you're probably suffering somewhere else. You probably have other areas you need to work on. So you don't need to overshoot those. There's a whole lot of benefit from what we see, because there's probably other areas where you need to put a bit more work into.
This idea of putting your energy elsewhere is absolutely vital in things like this. And what I refer to it as is go for the low-hanging fruit. So if you're somebody, we had a swimmer around 2.5 or 3 years ago, really high levels of endurance, incredible endurance, able to work very hard, do a lot of volume at it. Unfortunately, carrying heavy loads on their back wasn't the thing they were best at. And so we look at that low-hanging fruit. If I'm an underachiever, within 6 months, I'm going to be able to get to intermediate level or a fairly decent level across pretty much any domain. If that athlete or that person was to still keep pushing all of the aerobic work and all of the work capacity work and leaning into where they feel they're best, they wouldn't have taken any of those training priorities away. They wouldn't have gone for the low-hanging fruit. And when you look across those selection bands, you need to be average for the unit you want to go to. You want to be achieving at least average across the entire board. You do not want to be 99th percentile in one and the very bottom of the pack in the other. And there's a good reason for it. Firstly, standing out massively isn't a really good thing. You don't want to be standing out. You just want to be sitting in there. Top 70th percentile is pretty good for people who pass these selections. But the other side of that is there's a reason there is such a wide remit of tests. And that might be where you feel incredibly physically strong. On the other hand, you might have big deadlifts. You're really able to carry the load. But if there's any area where you're really falling down, it's incredibly apparent to everybody there. And so when we look at that, when we look at assigning those different amounts of training capital to A, B, C, and D, I want to make sure I'm pretty much covering across the board. And if I'm phenomenally good in one area, I'll skim a lot of that time off and put it in somewhere else.
So in terms of that, sticking with the load management and injury mitigation, I won't even say injury prevention because it just won't happen. There's just no way you're going to not get injured. Second only, or rugby is second to like this, you know, in terms of everyone gets injured, whether you catch your
Nobody
finger.
makes it out.
Nobody makes it out alive. You're going to get shin splints, you're going to get sore knees, you're going to get sore feet, you're going to get some kind of chafing that turns into an infection, you're going to get your finger caught in something. Something's going to happen, whether that be in your routine military career or on the selection training or on the selection day. Something is going to hurt. So the big thing I'll be looking at here is stuff that varies from cost effective to time effective. So if we go on the cheap and time effective, soft tissue work is going to be really useful here. So foam rolling, silly stuff like soft tissue ball into your plantar fascia, the arch of your foot, rolling that, dorsiflexion, have a lot of that available to your ankle range of motion, hip range of motion, loose quads, hamstrings, flexi there, range of motion in your thoracic, shoulders, pecs, doing this regularly, staying on top of it. Probably looking at daily if you can fit it into it. This stuff is incredibly useful, very underutilized from what we see in terms of military units and special forces and stuff like that. I'm sure it's hard to get time to do it, I'm very sure, but it's really useful for you, especially if you're going for it. Making this time, whether that's pre-session or pre-bed time, which is probably one of the best times to do it. If you got 15 minutes before you go to bed, soft tissue work, do your daily check, it would make a massive difference. The other end of the spectrum then is something that is really time effective, but unfortunately financially is very not effective in terms of it's probably not something you can justify spending funds on, because from what we've seen is finances in most cases aren't great. So if you look at someone like Alex Keekle, for example, and some of the stuff he recommends, he'd recommend stuff, let's say stem cell therapy, right? If you were training for this could be incredibly useful. Going in PRP or PRF stem cell therapy in Ireland could cost between 1,000 1,500. If you're in the military, there's probably a low chance.
Yeah.
Maybe if you're currently an operator, you might be able to get this, which would be great. But you probably aren't going to be able to get some of this for your knees, But if it's an option, if you can get the funds together, looking into these more exotic things. Look, I know peptides are whatever you want to look at them. Some countries are allowing doctors to use them. I know there's doctors in Ireland using them. If you're able to look down that route, and this is the thing you want to do, I'd be really, if you're in a position where things are really fucked up, it's worth a look.
It would definitely be. I think if you were talking to a carpenter and the carpenter's tools kept breaking, you'd say, clearly, I know a new Fez tool track saw is really expensive, but I think you're really going to have to spend the money on it.
Yeah.
And some of those treatments, like you're talking about, are just going to be one of those sunk costs. Like you're going to have to do it. Another area, and this is something I feel really, really strongly about, certain areas you should be spending money on and certain areas you don't have to spend that same amount of money on. First area I think you should spend the most amount of money you possibly can on is your boots.
Yeah.
You're going to be practicing rucking, practicing some of those longer marches in your boots. Depending on where you are, sometimes you have to wear a certain type of boot and they'll give that to you. You're obviously not in that case if you're going down this road. If you can choose your own boots, spend more money than you think you can on the boots. An area where you shouldn't really have to spend a massive amount of money is some sort of at-home cardio piece, whether that's a stationary bike or, in our case, we both love the assault bikes. There are cheap knockoffs of assault bikes out there now. I got one for €300, brand new, delivered to my house a few months ago. Having something like that available to you, the same way where having the lacrosse ball before you go to bed, if you can get those extra interval pieces in there, doing 2 or 3 of those over the course of a week, it will take 20 to 40 minutes to get those done. That will make a massive difference to all those physiological markers, which will improve your cardio, rather than going down the line of, I'm only buying a rowing machine if it's a Concept 2 rowing machine, or I'll have to get the very expensive assault bike. When you're training for this is going to be a somewhat temporary fix. You're getting something in there, you're using it as a tool. When you're using it at home, the demands are not the same as a commercial CrossFit gym having that piece of cardio equipment. So when we're going down the lines of this kind of programming, having that available to you at home that you can hop on in the morning or in the evening and get some cardio work done is incredibly valuable.
So in terms of actual strength training stuff that you would do, most of it is routine stuff, injuries allowing, so capacity allowing, back squats, front squats, maybe box squats. If the ankle mobility is terrible, you're a taller operator. Deadlifting, RDLs, strict press, loads and loads and loads of core work, loads of upper back work, hamstring work, lots of hinging stuff, lots of single leg work. And when you're going for qualification or testing, most of your training is kind of practicing. This is how I'd describe it. You're almost going through the motions, like you're trying to get a little bit further each time if you can. You know, if you're really unfamiliar with a piece of exercise or equipment, then you're going to be able to make some progress. But if you come to this training and you've been squatting for 8 years, you're probably going to see some regression. At a maximum, you're going to be maintaining. You're not going to see improvement. So if you come to this and you're a 200 kilo squatter, you're looking at average load being somewhere between 110 to 140 kilos.
Absolutely.
And probably seeing it regressing over the course of your intensive training coming up to this. So in the 3 months, let's say, leading up to the testing, you're going to see this probably regress, and it's probably going to feel heavy. You're probably going to feel fatigued. And that's okay, because it's still serving the purpose. Remember, we're thinking about you as a runner, an endurance athlete, or not as a strength or a power athlete. You know, you want to make sure running is a priority, and this is just peripherally supporting that stuff. So you're going to be doing 40 kilo lunges. You might be doing that 40 kilo lunges for 2 months. You might be doing 20 kilo box step ups for 2 months in a row. You might just be practicing them. You might be manipulating the load a little bit, but the endurance, your capacity is going to be pushed rather than the strength stuff.
In terms of those gym sessions, then mostly it's 2 times a week or sometimes 3 times a week, depending on the particular phase of training you have, as you're going from the major gain in capacity up to what we might consider to be a peak into your actual selection. 2 or 3 times a week is pretty much ideal. You don't want to be in the gym for too long. I would say 45 minutes to an hour in the gym is absolutely sufficient for pretty much all of your gym sessions here. When you're looking at the programs, and in preparation for this, I just looked at 2 of the programs from a couple of years ago. The strength work in those programs looks what a 800 to a 5k athlete would be doing in the gym. It's, as Owen talked about, you're looking to be an incredibly endurance specific athlete with all the strength you need to do your job, but definitely for the selection stuff, you are not pushing those strength numbers massively. The next area of training then, which I feel like is most forgotten about, is the specific cardio work that's not the running or rocking or anything like that. These would be the intervals, like Owen talked about, running intervals, hill sprints, work on a rowing machine, work on the bike. Use this particularly when you're a bit further out. So let's say 18 months to 8 months before the test. This is where the vast majority of your aerobic gains will be made. So you're talking about getting on a rowing machine. It might be 15 minutes on, 5 minutes off for 4 rounds. So you're just an hour on the rowing machine, trucking away through that. You really want to be looking to build up that mitochondrial density. You want to be getting those muscles as cardiovascularly adapted as possible. So you really want to be in that slow, steady state zone with these. Also, what I would say, when we look at the cardio work you're doing, and if we put this in as non-specific cardio work, you want to be trying to take the load away from the problems that are causing you issues, or the areas that are causing problems for you. So if you're finding on your rocking and stuff like that, that plantar fascia is starting to become inflamed, or maybe as you're going through some of the specific tests, your lower back is starting to give you trouble. If it's the lower back giving you trouble, you don't sit on the rowing machine for an hour and a half. If it's your plantar fascia giving you trouble, you don't go on the Woodward or you don't go on the treadmill for that cardio session. You basically pick a cardio piece of equipment that's going to take load away from the problem areas and put load onto other areas. If we could strap you onto an electrode machine and just allowed you to be fully static while causing you to breathe really heavily, that would be absolutely great. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist. Even things like a ski erg can be very, very valuable here, particularly if the lower body is giving you trouble. For some reason, many people we come across in this domain just have terrible, terrible knees. Cartilage is gone. their knees are bone on bone for whatever reason, probably due to their previous military career. They're struggling there, and in that case, we're looking to take impact off of those knees or off of those joints, and the ergs or the cardio machines really help us to get there.
So when it comes to training, when you're in your unit, whatever that is, it's much more enjoyable for everyone, to be honest. A lot of times you'll see it's much closer to generic S&C. So if you've run the Becoming a Horse program or something, it'll be a lot closer to that. A lot of times the athletes will just kind of have, obviously, a better understanding what's needed of them. So they'll be able to give you much more specific goals. But a lot of times they'll be pretty motivated to hit certain things. So like if you're coming to us, you obviously have an endearing interest in S&C work. So they'll be like, oh, I'd love to bench 180, or I'd love to squat 220 or squat 220 again. I'd like a better body composition. You'll usually see that. They'll be less worn out, a lot more relaxed with their training, have a lot more leeway to do what they want, basically. Certainly the longer they're in. And they'll have specific things they want to see. No, and a lot of them are squatting 220, by the way.
No.
You'll have things where they're like, I'd like to hit this 180 deadlift or 200 kilo deadlift again. Better body composition, you'll see more muscle mass, less worn out. So there's the biggest issue with people who are in these units is just them kind of disappearing for a month or two. And they'll come back and they're like, yeah, okay, I got the next month done. And you're like, oh, where were you? And they're like, I can't say.
What I find is the background in the videos of their squatting changes.
Yeah,
so the WhatsApps are coming in from somewhere very, very different. In terms of that in unit, or what we're talking about now specifically will be in country training, is in our experience there tends to be a fall off, and it's clear why it happens, right? But there's a fall off in programmed progression in this point. So they're going to the gym, they're training hard, training as hard as before in many cases, but oftentimes you don't see the same level of progress because it's clear, right? You can't follow a program because you don't know when you're going to get to the gym. What I would say is be as simple as possible with your programming in these cases. We have a home workout program. I cannot tell you how many people have run those home workout programs, but it's perfect. You just pick session A, you do session A. Next time you go to the gym, it might be 2 days later or it might be 2 weeks later. You go on and do session B, or you might repeat A again if it's been too long. But just have some sort of progression in this area. It allows for such better continuation of progress rather than this idea of just going to the gym and getting a workout in. Also, what can really help during this time is just refining those goals slightly. So the goal might be that before you wanted to be just an absolute horse of a human, you want to be the Captain America. In this case now, when you're in the slightly more refined situation, the weight room is different, or you mightn't actually have a weight room, just picking 1 or 2 things to get better at can be really, really valuable. I think it also gives you the idea of control, or the idea of you putting your time into something and getting good outcomes for you, which can be really mentally valuable in those cases as well. So definitely keep it in mind. Don't just suddenly disappear off the face of the planet for a while in terms of your training. You can still make progress.
So I think that kind of wraps it up there as a general theme on what we do with people in the special forces and related. So I'm not sure exactly how many, but there's well into the double digits. Again, it's never something we advertise. It was just over the years, a lot of people came to us, and we put up a piece on Instagram a few weeks ago, and there's a load of interest in how we would do it. So there's obviously out there.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of people going for these units, I think, from what we can see. I think a lot of people have a desire to do it, which is very interesting. Very, very tough. Obviously, the selection rates are very low compared to the number of people who go for them, and depending on the countries and stuff. So you know where to find us if you want a hand. We're kind of full at one-to-ones, to be honest, at the moment, but there's always special cases where, to be honest, if someone just emails us and it seems interesting, we'll do it. Where before...
You're not supposed to say that.
I actually think we can say that now, where if someone emails, they're like, look, this is my case, someone will make a space for, we have a very small number of one-to-ones at the moment, and they're either really long-term clients or someone who just has an interesting situation. So if you're in something interesting, do reach out to us if you're looking for that. Coaching at the moment is €400 a month, and Dara likes the special forces stuff.
Yeah.
So if you do email if you're looking for something, but if not, just check out the Sika Strength app on iOS and Android. And don't forget to sign up to the newsletter on SikaStrength.com.